The scissors were still in her hand when the silk tore apart. Marissa Bell froze in the middle of the private fitting room, her heart slamming against her ribs as the sound of ripping fabric echoed off the marble walls. The gown, the one she had spent 4 months designing, cutting and hand-sewing every single bead onto, hung in 2 broken pieces from the mannequin. The woman standing beside it, Vivian Lockhart, still had her fingers curled around the torn seam, her face twisted with a satisfaction she did not bother to hide. Marissa's mouth went dry. Around them, 3 assistants stood frozen, their eyes wide, none of them daring to speak. The event was set to begin in 11 minutes. Reporters were already seated in the grand hall outside. Cameras were being tested, and the dress that was supposed to be the centerpiece of the entire evening, the dress that carried Marissa's name and her future, was destroyed. "You clumsy little seamstress," Vivian said, her voice sweet and cruel at the same time. "Maybe you should have made something sturdier if you wanted it to survive one evening." "You did that on purpose," Marissa said quietly, her hands trembling as she stepped closer to the ruined gown. She could see now that the tear was not an accident. The fabric had been pulled apart deliberately, the seam ripped along a stress point that only someone who understood garment construction would know to target. Vivian smiled, tilting her head. "Prove it." Before Marissa could respond, the door to the fitting room opened, and every assistant in the room straightened like soldiers called to attention. Marissa turned, expecting another staff member, another photographer, someone from the event coordination team. Instead, she found herself looking into the eyes of a man she had only seen in photographs and whispered conversations among the wealthy clients who hired her. Damian Cross, the man whose family name alone could silence an entire room, the man everyone in this city spoke about in careful, lowered voices. The man Vivian Lockhart was engaged to marry in 4 months. He was not supposed to arrive for another hour. That was what the schedule said. That was what Marissa had been told when she agreed to design the gown Vivian would wear tonight. The gown meant to announce their engagement to the city's elite in the most dramatic fashion possible. But here he was, standing in the doorway, dressed in a dark suit that fit him with the kind of precision that told Marissa he never wore anything that was not tailored exactly to him. His eyes moved past Vivian without pausing and landed on the torn gown. Then they landed on Marissa. She felt exposed under that gaze, not because of anything improper, but because it felt like he was reading the entire situation in seconds, piecing together what had happened before anyone said a single word. "What happened here?" he said. It was not really a question. His voice was low, calm, and carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. "An accident," Vivian said quickly, releasing the torn fabric and smoothing her hands over her own dress, as though nothing had happened. "The seamstress used cheap material. It just fell apart the moment I touched it." Marissa's jaw tightened. She had built her entire reputation on quality. Every client who had ever worn her work knew that her seams held, that her fabric was chosen with care, that nothing she made simply fell apart. To hear her work described as cheap, in front of the one man in this city, whose opinion could end her career before it had truly begun, sent a wave of anger through her that she had to swallow down. "I don't use cheap material," Marissa said, keeping her voice steady, even though her hands were shaking at her sides. "I hand-select every fabric myself. That seam was pulled apart, not worn apart," she thought, for one bitter second, of every client who had ever looked at her curved figure and assumed her hands could not possibly be as skilled as a thinner designer's. She thought of the buyers who had turned her away from showroom floors early in her career, telling her that her body did not fit the image of the brand, as though a designer needed to be a walking advertisement rather than someone who understood fabric and form better than anyone else in the room. She had built her name from nothing, one careful stitch at a time, and she was not about to let a jealous woman with a talent for cruelty undo it in front of the one man whose opinion could open every door in this city. Vivian's eyes flashed, but before she could speak again, Damian raised a hand, just slightly, and the room went silent. He walked past his fiancée without acknowledging her and stopped in front of the ruined gown, studying it the way a man studies a contract before signing it. His eyes traced the stitching, the beadwork along the bodice, the delicate embroidery that curled along what remained of the skirt. "Who made this?" he asked, not looking away from the dress. I did, Marissa said. He finally turned to look at her fully. She stood a little taller under his gaze, refusing to shrink the way she might have with any other powerful man in this city. She had learned a long time ago that the moment she started apologizing for taking up space, in her work and in her body, people would treat her like she deserved to be smaller in every sense of the word. She had stopped doing that years ago, and she was not going to start now, not even in front of a man like Damian Cross. "This is exceptional work," he said. It was not a compliment offered lightly. His tone carried genuine surprise, as though he had expected something ordinary and found something far beyond that. The beating alone would have taken weeks. 6 weeks, Marissa said. For the beating, 4 months total. Something shifted in his expression, something Marissa could not quite name. He looked at the tier again, then at Vivian, then back at Marissa. "There is no event tonight without a gown," Vivian said, her voice climbing with the first note of real panic Marissa had heard from her. "Damian, we cannot go out there with nothing. This will be a disaster. The reporters are already seated." "Then you will need a replacement," Damian said simply, still watching Marissa. "Do you have another design ready?" Marissa blinked, caught off guard by the question. "No, this was the only one. I don't keep backup gowns for events like this. Each piece is made specifically for the client and the occasion." "Then improvise," he said, and there was something in his voice that told her this was not a suggestion. It was an expectation. He believed somehow, after seeing only the wreckage of her work, that she was capable of pulling something together in the minutes they had left. Marissa's mind raced. She thought of the fabric samples she had brought with her in case last-minute adjustments were needed, the bolt of deep emerald silk she had considered using for the bodice before settling on ivory instead, the spare beading kit tucked into her bag out of habit. It was not enough time to make anything close to what had been destroyed, but it might be enough time to make something. "I need everyone out of this room except my assistants," Marissa said, surprising herself with the authority in her own voice. "And I need 10 minutes before I can even tell you if this is possible." Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but Damian was already moving toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the frame as he turned back once more. "You have 10 minutes, he said. "Make it work." Then he was gone, taking Vivian with him despite her attempts to linger, and the fitting room fell into a stunned kind of quiet before Marissa snapped into motion. "Grace, get the emerald silk from my bag," she said, already pulling pins from the ruined gown to salvage what beadwork she could. "Noah, I need the bodice frame from the spare case. Elena, start unpicking this beading along the seam. We can reuse most of it if we're careful." Her assistants moved instantly, years of working together allowing them to fall into a rhythm without wasted words. Marissa's hands moved faster than her thoughts, muscle memory taking over where panic threatened to creep in. She had trained for moments like this without ever expecting one to actually happen. Late nights in design school building garments against impossible deadlines, just to prove to herself and everyone who doubted a plus-size woman could succeed in this industry that she belonged exactly where she stood. The emerald silk came together faster than she expected. She draped it directly onto the mannequin, pinning as she went, letting the fabric fall in a way that highlighted movement rather than fighting against it. She had always designed for real bodies, not the narrow ideal the fashion world clung to, and every technique she had developed over the years to make curves look powerful rather than hidden came rushing back to her now. She salvaged the beading from the ruined gown and began stitching it along the neckline of the new design, transforming what had been destroyed into something that felt reborn rather than repaired. Her mind, even in the chaos, drifted briefly to her mother, who had taught her to sew at a kitchen table in a small apartment, where every scrap of fabric was treated like treasure, because nothing could be wasted. Her mother used to say that a good seamstress never panicked over torn cloth, because cloth could always be remade into something new, something that told a different story than the one it started with. Marissa had never expected to apply that lesson to a Mafia boss's fitting room with a deadline measured in minutes, but her hands remembered the rhythm regardless. Pin, fold, stitch, smooth, as though her mother's voice were guiding every motion. 7 minutes in, she heard the door open again. She did not look up, too focused on the final stitches along the waistline, but she felt the presence in the room shift. When she finally glanced up, she found Damian, standing just inside the doorway again, watching her work, with an intensity that made her fingers falter for half a second, before she forced herself to continue. "You said 10 minutes, he said. "You have 3 left." "I know," Marissa said, not looking up. "I'm aware of time." A faint sound escaped him, something close to a laugh, though it was gone before she could be sure. She finished the final stitch, secured the last few beads along the shoulder, and stepped back, breathing hard, sweat gathering at her hairline despite the coolness of the room. The gown was not what she had originally designed. It was simpler, the silk pooling in soft folds rather than structured pleats, the beading concentrated along the neckline instead of scattered across the entire bodice. But it was striking in its own way, the deep emerald color rich against warm skin tones, the silhouette designed to move with the body wearing it rather than restrict it. "It's ready," Marissa said. Damien stepped closer to examine it, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Marissa found herself holding her breath, waiting for judgment she told herself she did not need from a man she had met less than 15 minutes ago, and yet somehow his opinion mattered more than she wanted to admit. "This is better than the original," he finally said. Marissa let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "That's kind, but it's not true. The original had 6 weeks of work in it." "I did not say it took more skill," he said. "I said it is better. Sometimes the fastest work reveals more than the careful work does." Before Marissa could respond, Vivian reappeared in the doorway, her earlier panic replaced with cold irritation, the moment she saw the new gown standing ready on the mannequin. She looked it over with narrowed eyes, clearly searching for something to criticize, but the color suited her, the cut was flattering, and there was nothing obvious to fault. "Fine," Vivian said stiffly. "I suppose it will do." Marissa's assistants helped Vivian into the gown, while Marissa stood back, watching the fabric settle exactly as she had intended, the beading catching the light with every small movement. She felt a strange mixture of pride and exhaustion, the adrenaline of the last 10 minutes finally beginning to fade. Damien remained by the door the entire time, his attention drifting between Vivian in the new gown and Marissa standing quietly to the side. When Vivian finally turned to face him, expecting the reaction she believed she deserved, he studied her for only a moment before his eyes moved back to Marissa. "You have a gift," he said, addressing Marissa directly, even as Vivian stood dressed and waiting beside him. "Most people in this industry design for one kind of body and call it fashion. You clearly understand something they do not." "Thank you," Marissa said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks despite herself. "We should go," Vivian said sharply, looping her arm through Damien's with a possessiveness that made the temperature in the room drop several degrees. "The reporters are waiting." Damien allowed himself to be led toward the door, but he paused once more at the threshold, turning back to look at Marissa one last time. "Someone will contact you tomorrow about compensation for the damage to the original gown," he said, "and about future work." Then he was gone, Vivian's heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as they disappeared down the hallway toward the waiting cameras and reporters, toward an evening that would announce their engagement to the entire city. Marissa sank into the nearest chair the moment the door closed, her legs finally giving out beneath the exhaustion she had been holding back. Grace handed her a bottle of water without a word, and Elena began quietly cleaning up the mess of pins and fabric scraps scattered across the fitting room floor. Noah gathered the ruined gown carefully, folding what remained of it with the same care Marissa had used to create it in the first place. "That was insane," Grace finally said, breaking the silence. "I thought we were finished. I thought that woman had just ended everything." "She almost did," Marissa admitted, taking a long drink of water. Her hands were still trembling slightly, though whether from exhaustion or something else, she could not quite tell. "He seemed impressed," Noah offered, folding the last piece of the ruined gown into a garment bag. "Really impressed. That's not nothing, coming from him." Marissa did not answer right away. She was thinking about the way Damien Cross had looked at her work, not with the polite, dismissive interest most wealthy clients showed, but with genuine attention, as though he had actually seen what she had built rather than simply glancing at it. She was thinking about the calm authority in his voice when he told her to make it work, as though he had never once doubted that she could. She was also thinking, though she pushed the thought away almost as quickly as it arrived, about the coldness in Vivian Lockhart's eyes when she tore the seam apart, and the fact that no one in that room, not the assistants, not even Damien himself in that first moment, seemed the least bit surprised that she had done it. As Marissa packed away her tools and prepared to leave for the evening, one of the assistants brought her the garment bag containing the ruined gown, the one Vivian had destroyed only an hour before. Marissa took it carefully, planning to examine the damage later, to see if any part of it could be salvaged or repurposed for future work. She had learned long ago never to waste good fabric, no matter how the piece had met its end. Outside, the night air was cool against her flushed skin, and the city lights blurred slightly as her eyes adjusted after hours spent under the harsh brightness of the fitting room. She walked to her car with the garment bag slung carefully over one arm, her mind replaying the evening in fragments, the sound of tearing silk, the cold satisfaction on Vivian's face, the unexpected steadiness in Damien's voice when he told her to make it work. She had built a career on being underestimated and proving people wrong, but nothing about tonight fit neatly into anything she had experienced before. She placed the garment bag in the back seat of her car with the same care she gave every piece she had ever made, ruined or not, and sat for a long moment behind the wheel without starting the engine, simply breathing, letting the adrenaline finally drain out of her body. Somewhere across the city, cameras were flashing as Vivian Lockhart stepped out in the gown Marissa had built from nothing in 10 frantic minutes, and no one watching would ever know the truth of what had happened backstage. Marissa told herself that was fine, that recognition was not why she did this work, that the satisfaction of solving an impossible problem under pressure was reward enough on its own. But as she finally turned the key and pulled out into the quiet street, she could not stop thinking about the way Damien Cross had looked at her, not at the gown, not at the spectacle of the moment, but at her, as though he had seen something in her that he had not expected to find in that room at all. She had no way of knowing, as she drove home with the garment bag resting quietly in the back seat, that something hidden inside the lining of that ruined gown was about to change everything. The letter fell out of the lining at 3 in the morning, and Marissa nearly missed it entirely. She had not planned to touch the ruined gown again so soon. It sat on her workbench for 2 days, a quiet reminder of the strangest evening of her professional life, while she caught up on the backlog of orders that had piled up during the weeks she spent building it. But something about leaving it untouched bothered her, the way an unfinished sentence bothers a writer, and so on the third night, unable to sleep, she carried the garment bag to her workbench and began carefully unpicking what remained of the bodice, determined to salvage the boning, the interior structure, anything reusable before she let the damaged fabric go entirely. Her scissors caught on something stiff between 2 layers of lining fabric, something that should not have been there. She paused, fingers exploring the small pocket she had unknowingly sewn into the gown weeks earlier, during a moment of exhaustion she barely remembered. She had been finishing the interior structure late one night, and she recalled now, faintly, tucking something into the lining before she lost the thread of the memory entirely. She worked the seam open carefully and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn soft at the edges from being pressed against fabric for weeks. Her own handwriting covered the page, hurried and slanted the way it always became when she wrote late at night, with her mind racing faster than her hand could follow. It was a letter to her mother, who had passed away 3 years earlier, written during one of the long nights she spent alone in her workshop, when the loneliness of running a business by herself became too heavy to carry silently. She had written things in that letter she had never said out loud to anyone, about how frightened she was that she would fail, about how much she missed hearing her mother's voice guide her through difficult stitches, about how every gown she made now felt like a conversation with someone who was no longer there to answer. She had forgotten entirely that she tucked it into the lining instead of the drawer where she usually kept things like this, a habit born from grief that let her carry pieces of her mother into every dress she built. She sat on the floor of her workshop, letter in hand, and felt tears gather without warning, the exhaustion of the last few days finally catching up to her all at once. She thought about the years since her mother's passing, how she had thrown herself into building the business almost as a way of avoiding the silence that followed, filling every waking hour with fabric orders and client fittings, so there would be no empty space left for grief to settle into. She had told herself that staying busy was strength, that other designers who took time to properly mourn were simply choosing a different path. But sitting there on the cold workshop floor with her own handwriting staring back at her, she understood for the first time in a long while just how much she had been running rather than healing. Her mother had been the one who taught her that clothing was never just fabric and thread, that a well-made garment could hold memory the way a photograph could, that the hands of the person who made something left an imprint on it whether anyone else could see it or not. Marissa had believed that once, deeply, and somewhere in the exhaustion of building a business alone, she had nearly forgotten it. Finding the letter reminded her, painfully and unexpectedly, of everything she had set aside in the name of survival. She did not know that the letter had already been found once before, by someone else entirely, before she ever cut open the lining herself. Damien Cross had taken the ruined gown from the fitting room that night, not out of any decision made in advance, but because something about the craftsmanship refused to leave his thoughts. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the kind of professional interest a man in his position often had in things built with genuine skill, but even he recognized that explanation felt thinner than it should have. He had instructed one of his staff to send the gown to his home, rather than back to the designer immediately, intending to examine the construction more closely, to understand what exactly had impressed him so deeply in those 10 frantic minutes. He found the letter 2 nights before Marissa did, while turning the ruined gown over in his hands in the quiet of his study, running his fingers along the same seam she would later cut open herself. It fell into his palm unexpectedly, and though every instinct told him to fold it away unread, respect for privacy warring briefly with curiosity, he found himself reading the first line before he could stop himself, and then he could not stop at all. He read about a woman who missed her mother so deeply that she spoke to her through fabric and thread. He read about fear, disguised as ambition, about a designer who built an entire career out of proving that she deserved to take up space in an industry that constantly told women like her that they did not belong. He read, line by line, a version of Marissa Bell that had nothing to do with the composed professional he met briefly in that fitting room, and everything to do with the person underneath that composure. By the time he finished, he understood that he had learned something about her that she had never intended to share with anyone, let alone a stranger she had spoken to for less than 15 minutes. It felt like an intrusion, and yet he could not bring himself to regret reading it. Something about her honesty, raw and unguarded in a way his own world rarely allowed, had settled into him and refused to leave. Damien had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who measured every word before speaking it, who calculated advantage in every conversation, who treated vulnerability as a weakness to be hidden or exploited, depending on which side of the negotiation they stood on. Vivian herself was a product of that same world, raised within a family that valued appearances over honesty, taught from childhood that emotion was a currency to be spent strategically rather than felt sincerely. He had accepted that as simply how his world functioned, had built his own walls just as high in response, until a folded letter fell out of a ruined dress and reminded him that people could still exist who wrote their grief down in the dark simply because they needed somewhere to put it. He thought about his own mother, gone now for over a decade, and the letters he had never written to her, the conversations he had never had the courage to finish while she was still alive to hear them. Reading Marissa's private words felt like glimpsing a version of grief he recognized but had never allowed himself to express so plainly. It unsettled him more than he wanted to admit, sitting alone in his study long after the household had gone quiet, turning the folded page over in his hands as though it might reveal something more if he simply looked long enough. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back exactly where he found it, tucked into the lining, and gave instructions the following morning that the gown be returned to Marissa's workshop, along with a formal note about compensation for the damage caused during the fitting. Now, sitting on her workshop floor at 3 a.m, Marissa had no idea that the letter she held in trembling hands had already been read by the very man whose fiancé had destroyed the dress in the first place. She refolded it carefully, pressed it against her chest for a moment, the way she might once have hugged her mother, and set it aside on the workbench, before continuing her work on the salvageable pieces of the gown. Grief was not something she allowed herself to sit with for long these days, not with orders to fulfill, and a business that depended entirely on her own two hands, so she pushed forward, cataloging the boning and beating she could reuse, sorting through what remained, until exhaustion finally forced her toward sleep sometime near dawn. The knock on her workshop door came the following afternoon, unannounced and unexpected. Marissa opened it to find a man in a dark suit standing outside, not Damien Cross himself, but clearly someone who worked for him, given the careful, formal way he introduced himself as a representative handling compensation matters on behalf of Mr. Cross. Mr. Cross would like to discuss a business arrangement, the man said, handing Marissa a sealed envelope. He asks that you consider becoming the exclusive designer for events hosted by his family. Compensation for the damaged gown is included in this envelope, along with details of the proposal, should you wish to accept. Marissa stared at the envelope for a long moment before taking it, her mind racing through the implications of what she was hearing. An exclusive arrangement with a family as powerful and connected as the Cross family could transform her business overnight, opening doors that had remained firmly closed to her throughout her entire career despite her talent. But something about the suddenness of the offer, coming only 3 days after the disaster in the fitting room, made her cautious. "Why me?" she asked. "There are dozens of established designers in this city who would welcome an arrangement like this." Mr. Cross was specific, the representative said. "He wants you." That evening, Marissa sat at her kitchen table and opened the envelope properly, reading through the terms of the proposed arrangement with careful attention. The compensation for the ruined gown alone was more generous than she expected, enough to cover months of expenses and material costs without strain. The exclusive designer arrangement promised steady, significant income, along with the kind of visibility that could elevate her entire business into a different category of recognition. But beneath the practical details, she found herself thinking again about the way Damien Cross had looked at her work in that fitting room, the genuine surprise and respect in his voice when he called it exceptional. She told herself that businessmen like him complimented things strategically, that his interest in her work was purely professional, and yet some quiet part of her refused to fully believe that explanation. She called the number listed at the bottom of the letter the following morning, and to her surprise, Damien himself answered rather than an assistant. "Miss Bell," he said, his voice as calm and steady as she remembered from the fitting room. "I hope the proposal was clear." "It was generous," Marissa said carefully. "Almost too generous. I wanted to ask why, before I agree to anything." There was a pause on the line, brief but noticeable. "Your work deserves recognition it has not received. I intend to correct that." "That's not really an answer," Marissa said, surprising herself with her own directness. She had learned, through years of navigating an industry that often did not take her seriously, that vague compliments from powerful people usually hid something else entirely, and she was not willing to sign anything without understanding the full picture. Another pause, longer this time. "You're right," he finally said. "It's not the full answer. I saw something in that fitting room that I don't often see in my line of work. Honesty, skill without pretense. I would like to work with someone who has both of those qualities, regardless of what else might be true." Marissa sat with that answer for a long moment, unsure exactly what he meant by the phrase, regardless of what else might be true, but something in his voice told her this was as much truth as he was willing to offer over the phone. She thought about her business, about the years of struggle behind her, about the opportunity sitting in front of her now, wrapped in uncertainty she could not fully name. "I'll need to see the full contract before I agree to anything," she said. "And I'll need creative control over my designs. I don't work well when someone else is dictating the vision." "Agreed," Damien said, and she could hear something like approval in his voice. "I would expect nothing less from someone with your talent." They arranged a meeting for the following week to finalize the details, and when Marissa hung up the phone, she sat quietly in her kitchen for a long time, turning the conversation over in her mind. She told herself this was purely a business decision, an opportunity too significant to refuse, regardless of the strange circumstances surrounding it. She told herself the flutter of anticipation she felt at the thought of seeing Damien Cross again had nothing to do with the man himself, and everything to do with the opportunity his name represented. She was still telling herself that 3 days later, When Vivian Lockhart arrived unannounced at her workshop, her expression sharp, with the kind of suspicion that told Marissa this visit had nothing to do with fashion at all. "I hear you're going to be working closely with my fiancé," Vivian said, stepping into the workshop without waiting for an invitation, her eyes sweeping over the fabric bolts and half-finished garments with open disdain. "I wanted to come see for myself what exactly he finds so interesting about you." Marissa set down the pins she had been holding, her earlier excitement about the arrangement cooling into something more guarded. "It's a business arrangement, Miss Lockhart. Nothing more." "Is it?" Vivian said, circling slowly through the workshop like she was assessing territory rather than making conversation. "Because he does not usually take this kind of personal interest in vendors, not even ones who nearly ruined our engagement announcement." "I fixed what you broke," Marissa said evenly, refusing to let the accusation stand unchallenged. "In 10 minutes, in front of everyone." "That's not nothing." Vivian's eyes narrowed, the composed cruelty from the fitting room resurfacing beneath her polished exterior. "Careful," she said quietly. "Damien is engaged to me. Whatever fascination he has with your little sob story will pass. It always does. Men like him grow bored quickly, and when he does, you will find that this city is smaller than you think, for anyone who has made an enemy of the Lockhart name." The threat hung in the air between them, quiet and precise, delivered with the calm confidence of someone who had made good on similar warnings before. Marissa held her ground, refusing to let Vivian see how the words landed, though her pulse quickened with the understanding that this arrangement she was about to enter carried risks far beyond ordinary business complications. Vivian left as abruptly as she arrived, her heels clicking sharply against the workshop floor, leaving Marissa alone with the fabric and the half-finished garments, and the growing certainty that whatever was beginning between her and Damien Cross, intentional or not, was about to become far more complicated than a simple business arrangement ever could be. Marissa stood in the silence for a long time after the door closed, listening to her own pulse settle back into a normal rhythm. She had faced difficult clients before, people who questioned her prices or doubted her abilities because of how she looked rather than what she could create, but there had been something different in Vivian's voice. Something colder and more deliberate than simple jealousy. It was the voice of a woman who had learned, over years of moving through a dangerous world, exactly how to make a threat sound like polite conversation. She thought about walking away from the arrangement entirely, about calling Damien back and explaining that the risk was not worth whatever opportunity his family name could offer her business. It would have been the safer choice, the one her mother might have counseled, given how carefully she had always taught Marissa to avoid unnecessary danger. But safety had never built anything remarkable, and Marissa had spent too many years accepting smaller opportunities out of caution to start retreating now, not when something inside her recognized that this moment, frightening as it was, might be the turning point her career had been waiting for. She gathered the pins scattered across her workbench and returned to the half-finished garment she had been working on before Vivian's visit interrupted her, forcing her hands back into motion, even though her mind remained fixed on the warning she had just received. Whatever came next, she told herself, she would face it the same way she faced every impossible deadline and every doubtful client who had ever underestimated her, with steady hands and a refusal to be made smaller than she was. Outside, the evening light was fading over the city, and somewhere across town, in a house far grander than her modest workshop, Damien Cross sat alone with a folded letter he had already read twice, wondering how a woman he barely knew had managed to unsettle the careful order of his entire life in less than a week. The contract sat unsigned on the table between them for nearly a full minute, before Marissa finally picked up the pen. She had read every clause twice, then a third time overnight, circling anything unclear, and preparing a list of questions she intended to raise, before agreeing to anything. Damien's private office occupied the top floor of a building downtown, all dark wood and glass, the kind of space designed to remind visitors exactly whose territory they were standing in. Marissa had expected intimidation tactics, delays, perhaps an attempt to pressure her into signing without reading carefully. Instead, Damien answered every question she raised, directly, adjusted 2 clauses without argument, when she pointed out language that gave him more control over her designs than she was comfortable granting, and waited patiently while she worked through her concerns one by one. "You're thorough," he said, watching her cross out a section regarding exclusivity rights and rewrite it in the margin. "Most people sign without reading half of this." "Most people haven't had a contract used against them before," Marissa said, not looking up from the page. "I learned that lesson early. I don't intend to repeat it." He did not press for details, though she could tell from the slight shift in his expression that the comment had registered with him, filed away for later rather than dismissed. When she finally signed her name at the bottom of the last page, she felt a strange mixture of relief and apprehension settle over her, the practical part of her mind celebrating the security this arrangement would bring her business, while some quieter instinct reminded her of the warning Vivian had delivered in her workshop only days earlier. "There's one more thing," Inrian said, once the papers were gathered and set aside. He reached into a drawer of his desk and retrieved a small folded piece of paper, and Marissa's stomach dropped the moment she recognized her own handwriting. "Where did you find that?" she asked quietly, her voice tighter than she intended. "In the lining," he said. "I found it before you did. I should have mentioned it sooner. I apologize for the intrusion. I read further than I should have, before I realized what it was." Marissa took the letter back from him with trembling fingers, torn between embarrassment that a stranger had read her most private grief, and a strange, unexpected gratitude that he had chosen to tell her the truth, rather than simply pretend he had never seen it. Most people in his position, she suspected, would have said nothing at all. "I'm sorry about your mother," Damien said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the businesslike formality he had carried through most of their meeting. "I lost mine as well. Different circumstances, but I understand the particular kind of silence that follows." Marissa studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the calculation she expected to find in a man like him, the strategic softness powerful people sometimes perform to gain trust. She found none of it. What she found instead was something closer to recognition, one grief acknowledging another across a desk covered in legal paperwork. "Thank you for telling me," she finally said, "instead of pretending you never saw it." "I don't make a habit of pretending," he said, "even when honesty is inconvenient." Over the following weeks, their working relationship settled into a rhythm neither of them had entirely anticipated. Marissa began designing for a series of events hosted by the Cross family, gowns for charity galas, formal wear for business dinners that doubled as delicate negotiations conducted in expensive dining rooms, and each project brought her into closer contact with Damien than a purely professional arrangement typically required. He visited her workshop more often than seemed strictly necessary for a man who could easily have sent representatives instead, and she found herself looking forward to those visits with an anticipation she was reluctant to examine too closely. He asked about her process, genuinely curious rather than simply making polite conversation, and she found herself explaining techniques she had never bothered describing to other clients, the way certain fabrics needed to be cut against the grain to drape correctly over curves, the specific tension required in hand stitching to make beading move naturally rather than sitting stiff against the body. He listened with the kind of focused attention she rarely received from anyone, let alone someone whose time was worth more per hour than most people earned in a week. "You could teach this," he told her one afternoon, watching her work a difficult seam along a bodice destined for an upcoming gala. "Most designers I've met treat their techniques like secrets. You explain everything like it should be obvious." "It should be," Marissa said, focused on her stitching. "The industry just doesn't want it to be. Keeping knowledge locked away protects people who got there first. I'd rather more designers like me got the chance to learn properly, instead of guessing their way through it the way I had to." "Is that why you started your own business, instead of working under someone established?" Marissa paused, setting down her needle to consider the question properly. "Partly. Mostly it's because no established house would hire a designer who looked like me for anything beyond alterations. I got tired of being told I could sew clothes for other people's bodies, but never design anything meant to be seen. So I built something where that decision wasn't up to anyone but me." Damien was quiet for a moment, something thoughtful crossing his expression. "That's the kind of decision most people talk about making and never actually follow through on." "I didn't have the luxury of not following through," Marissa said simply. "Talking about it doesn't pay rent." One evening, well after her assistants had gone home for the day, Damien arrived carrying takeout from a small restaurant a few streets over, claiming he had been in the area finalizing details for an upcoming gala and thought she might not have eaten yet. Marissa, who had in fact forgotten to eat since breakfast, found herself accepting without the hesitation she probably should have felt given everything Vivian had already warned her about. They ate at the small table tucked into the corner of her workshop, surrounded by bolts of fabric and half-finished garments hanging from dress forms, and the conversation drifted away from business entirely for the first time since they had met. Damien asked about her childhood, about the small apartment where her mother taught her to sew, about the years of school where she had been the only student in her design program who did not fit the narrow physical mold most instructors seem to expect from anyone claiming to understand fashion. "They told me once that I should focus on pattern making instead of design," Marissa said, picking at the last of her noodles. "Behind-the-scenes work, they called it, as if my ideas about beauty didn't count because I didn't look like the kind of woman fashion magazines put on their covers." "That's absurd," Damien said, and there was genuine anger in his voice, quiet but unmistakable. "Your understanding of how fabric moves on a real body is exactly what makes your work exceptional. Anyone who told you otherwise was protecting their own limited imagination, not offering useful criticism." Marissa looked up at him, surprised by the conviction in his tone. Most people offered polite reassurance when she shared stories like this, careful sympathy that never quite committed to genuine outrage. Damien's reaction felt different, sharper, as though the unfairness of it genuinely offended something in him beyond simple politeness. "You sound like you actually mean that," she said. "I do," he said simply. "I've spent my life around people who judge worth by surface appearance, by which family someone was born into, by how well they perform the correct image in public. It's exhausting, and it rarely has anything to do with actual substance. You have more substance in your smallest finished seam than most people I know have in their entire public persona." The compliment settled somewhere deep in Marissa's chest, warm and unfamiliar, and she found herself looking away first, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how easily this conversation had drifted from professional courtesy into something that felt dangerously personal. Their conversations continued like that in the weeks that followed, threading through the practical details of each new commission, occasionally drifting into territory neither of them quite acknowledged as anything beyond professional interest, though the growing ease between them suggested otherwise to anyone watching closely enough. Marissa's assistants noticed first, exchanging glances whenever Damien arrived unannounced, whenever he stayed longer than any business matter strictly required, whenever Marissa's usual brisk efficiency softened slightly in his presence, without her seeming to realize it herself. Vivian noticed as well, and her visits to the workshop became more frequent, each one carrying the same undercurrent of thinly veiled hostility, though she was careful never to cross into anything Marissa could point to directly as sabotage. She would arrive to inspect progress on gowns meant for events she would be attending, offering criticism dressed up as feedback, questioning fabric choices that had already been approved, suggesting changes at the last possible moment that would have forced Marissa into unreasonable timelines had she actually implemented them. "I just want to make sure everything reflects well on the family," Vivian said during one such visit, running her fingers over a bolt of deep burgundy silk Marissa had selected for an upcoming winter gala. "You understand, I'm sure, given your background. Some people simply weren't raised around this kind of world. It takes time to learn what's appropriate." Marissa had grown accustomed to this particular flavor of insult, delivered with a smile sweet enough to disguise the cruelty underneath, for anyone not paying close attention. She had learned long ago that responding with visible anger only gave people like Vivian more satisfaction, so she kept her expression neutral, her voice professionally polite. "I've been designing for events like this for years, Miss Lockhart. I understand exactly what's appropriate." "Of course you do," Vivian said, though her tone suggested the opposite entirely. "I only mention it because I'd hate for another mistake to happen. Accidents seem to follow you rather closely." The implied threat was unmistakable, a quiet reminder that the torn gown had not been forgotten, that Vivian was fully capable of repeating whatever tactics necessary to protect her position. Marissa held her ground, refusing to let the words rattle her outwardly, though she made a mental note to keep detailed records of every interaction from that point forward. understanding instinctively that she might need proof of good faith dealing if Vivian's hostility ever escalated into something more concrete. After Vivian left that day, Marissa called Grace into the workshop and asked her, calmly and without explanation, to begin photographing every commission at each stage of completion and keeping a written log of every visitor who came through the door. Grace did not ask why, though her expression suggested she understood well enough given the tension that had been building for weeks. Marissa told herself the precaution was simply good business practice, the kind of documentation any careful designer should maintain, and refused to examine too closely the quiet fear underneath that decision, the sense that she was preparing evidence for a conflict she could feel building on the horizon, like weather she could not yet see but could already smell in the air. It was during a fitting for the winter gala, 3 weeks into their working arrangement, that the tension finally surfaced in front of Damien directly. Vivian arrived unannounced while Marissa was making final adjustments to a gown intended for another client entirely, one of Damien's business associates who had specifically requested Marissa's work after hearing about her from mutual connections within the Cross family circle. "This seems like an odd use of your time," Vivian said, studying the gown with obvious disapproval, "when you're supposedly designing exclusively for family events. The contract allows for outside commissions that don't conflict with family event scheduling," Marissa said evenly, continuing her work without looking up. "Mr. Cross approved the arrangement personally." "Did he?" Vivian said, her voice sharpening. "How convenient that he approves so many things regarding you personally these days." Damien, who had arrived moments earlier to review progress on the winter gala gown, stepped fully into the room at that comment, his expression cooling into something Marissa had not seen from him before, a controlled sharpness that reminded her, briefly and uncomfortably, exactly what kind of world he came from. "Vivian," he said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge, "this is a business matter. Marissa's arrangements with other clients are not your concern." "Everything that reflects on this family is my concern," Vivian snapped, her carefully composed exterior cracking for the first time in Marissa's presence. "Especially when my future husband seems to have developed a habit of showing up unannounced at his designer's workshop far more often than any business matter requires." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Marissa to feel distinctly out of place, caught between two people whose relationship carried history and complications she had no part in creating. Damien's jaw tightened, and for a moment, something almost like guilt flickered across his face before it disappeared behind the same controlled calm he wore in every negotiation. "We'll discuss this at home," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for further argument in front of witnesses. Vivian's eyes flicked to Marissa, cold and calculating, despite the anger still visible beneath her composed exterior. "Yes," she said, "we certainly will." She left without another word, her heels striking sharp, deliberate notes against the workshop floor, and Marissa found herself standing in the aftermath of a confrontation she had not asked to be part of, watching Damien carefully rebuild the composure Vivian's accusation had briefly shattered. "I apologize for that," he said quietly, once the workshop door closed behind Vivian's retreating figure. "You don't owe me an apology," Marissa said, though her voice carried more uncertainty than she intended. "But I think we should both be careful about how this arrangement looks to other people. I don't want my business caught in the middle of whatever is happening between you two." Damien studied her for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "You're right," he said, "though I'm not entirely certain, anymore, exactly what is happening between us either." The admission hung in the air between them, honest in a way neither of them had allowed themselves to be before, and Marissa found she had no easy response to offer in return. She busied herself instead with folding the fabric scraps scattered across her workbench, needing something to do with her hands while her thoughts settled into some kind of order. She thought about the contract she had signed weeks earlier, about the careful boundaries she had promised herself she would maintain, about how easily those boundaries seemed to be dissolving despite her best intentions. She had built her entire career on being taken seriously as a professional, and she refused to let anyone, even someone as compelling as Damien Cross, reduce her to a complication in someone else's engagement. "I think you should go," she said finally, though the words came out gentler than she intended, softened by something she was not yet ready to name. "Not because of anything you've done wrong, Because I think we both need time to understand what exactly this is, separately. Before we say anything else neither of us can take back. Damien nodded slowly, respect visible in the way he accepted her request without argument. That's fair, he said. I'll see you at the gala fitting next week. He paused at the door, turning back once more the way he had that first night in the fitting room. For what it's worth, he said, I meant what I said earlier. About your work. About you. Then he was gone, leaving Marissa alone in her workshop, with fabric scraps scattered across the floor, and a growing certainty that whatever this was becoming between them, it had already moved far beyond anything a contract could properly define. She locked up the workshop that night with her mind still racing, replaying every word of their conversation, and drove home through empty streets, wondering how a business arrangement meant to protect her career had somehow become the most complicated relationship of her adult life. The accusation arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by two men in dark suits who filled the entire doorway of Marissa's workshop before she had even finished her first cup of coffee. Miss Bell, the taller of the two said, his tone formal in a way that immediately set every alarm bell in Marissa's mind ringing at once. We need to speak with you regarding missing jewelry from the Cross family collection. A necklace, reportedly worn by Miss Lockhart during her most recent fitting, was found to be missing following your last visit to the family estate. Marissa set down her coffee cup carefully, her hands suddenly unsteady despite her effort to appear composed. I don't know anything about missing jewelry. I was there to finalize alterations on the gala gown. I never went near any jewelry. Miss Lockhart has stated otherwise, the second man said, his expression unreadable. She claims you were alone in the room where the necklace was kept, prior to it going missing. The accusation settled over Marissa like ice water, the implications crashing into her all at once. She thought immediately of the detailed logs Grace had been keeping for weeks, the photographs documenting every stage of her work, and felt a small measure of relief that she had listened to her instincts, rather than dismissing the growing unease as paranoia. I have documentation of every visit, Marissa said, forcing steadiness into her voice even as her heart pounded. Photographs, timestamps, witnesses. I was never alone with any jewelry. My assistant was present for the entire fitting. The men exchanged a glance that told Marissa this was not the answer they expected, though their expressions remained carefully neutral. We'll need to see that documentation, the taller man said, and we'll need to speak with your assistant as well. Grace, who had been listening from the back of the workshop, stepped forward without hesitation, confirming every detail Marissa had just provided. Between the two of them, they produced photographs, time-stamped from the exact hours in question, showing Marissa working on the gown in a room entirely separate from where the family kept its valuables, with Grace visible in the background of nearly every image. The men left an hour later, taking copies of the documentation with them, their formal courtesy unable to fully mask the awkwardness of an accusation that had clearly fallen apart under scrutiny. But Marissa remained shaken long after they departed, understanding with sudden clarity exactly how close she had come to having her entire career destroyed by an accusation with no basis in truth. Grace closed the workshop door behind the two men and turned to Marissa, her own hands trembling slightly now that the tension of the confrontation had passed. That was terrifying, she said. If we hadn't kept those photos, if I hadn't been in the room that day, they would have believed her completely. No questions asked. I know, Marissa said quietly, sinking into the nearest chair as the adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation began to drain away, leaving something closer to exhaustion in its place. That's exactly what she was counting on. She wasn't trying to actually prove I stole anything. She just needed the accusation itself to do the damage. An investigation alone would have been enough to scare away half my clients, regardless of how it eventually resolved. She thought about how carefully calculated the entire scheme had been, timed for a moment when she was alone enough to seem plausible as a suspect, targeted at the one vulnerability that could threaten everything she had built without a single physical piece of evidence required. It was not the reckless cruelty of the torn dress from weeks earlier. This was something colder, more patient, the work of someone willing to wait for the perfect opportunity to strike where the damage would be most severe. You need to tell him everything, Grace said, not just what happened today, all of it. The visits, the comments she's made, The way she's been circling this whole arrangement since the beginning. Marissa nodded slowly, already reaching for her phone, understanding that whatever careful boundaries she had tried to maintain between business and something more personal no longer mattered, given what had just occurred. This was no longer simply about protecting a professional arrangement. It was about protecting herself from someone willing to manufacture a crime rather than lose control of a situation she could no longer manage through intimidation alone. She called Damien immediately, her hands still trembling as she dialed his number. "I need to speak with you," she said, the moment he answered. "In person, today." He arrived at her workshop within the hour, his expression darkening as she explained everything that had happened, the two men, the accusation, the documentation that had saved her from what could have easily become a criminal investigation into a theft she had no part in. "This ends now," Damien said, his voice carrying a coldness Marissa had not heard from him before, the controlled fury of a man accustomed to handling problems decisively. "I'll speak with Vivian directly." "Damien," Marissa said carefully, watching him gather himself to leave, "be careful. If she's willing to fabricate a theft accusation, she's willing to do worse. I don't want you walking into that conversation without understanding what you're dealing with." He paused at the door, something softening in his expression despite the anger still visible underneath. "You're worried about me," he said, something like surprise in his voice. "Of course I am," Marissa said, the admission slipping out before she could carefully consider it the way she usually did. "Regardless of everything else, I don't want to see you hurt either." He crossed the space between them before she fully registered the movement, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid between them finally pressing too heavily to ignore any longer. "I should have ended things with Vivian months ago," he said quietly. "Before any of this began, I stayed because of family obligations, business alliances that mattered more to my father than they ever did to me. I told myself, loyalty to that arrangement was more important than my own instincts. I was wrong." He told her about the years leading up to the engagement, how his father had arranged the match while Damien was still young enough to believe that duty and desire could eventually become the same thing if he simply worked hard enough at pretending. He had convinced himself for a long time that affection would grow naturally out of familiarity, that the absence of genuine warmth between them was simply the price of belonging to a family whose survival depended on carefully chosen alliances rather than sentiment. It was only in the weeks since meeting Marissa that he had finally allowed himself to recognize the difference between duty and the kind of connection that required no performance at all. "You don't owe me an explanation," Marissa said, though her voice betrayed how much she wanted to hear one regardless. "I know," he said. "I'm giving you one anyway." The confrontation with Vivian happened that same evening, though Marissa was not present for it, learning the details only afterward through the careful, measured account Damien provided when he returned to the workshop late that night, his composure restored, but something fundamentally changed in the set of his shoulders. Vivian had denied everything initially, he told her, insisting the accusation had come from genuine concern rather than manipulation, that the necklace truly had gone missing, and Marissa remained a reasonable suspect given her presence at the estate that day. But when Damien produced the documentation Marissa had provided, time-stamped and witnessed, Vivian's careful composure had finally cracked entirely. She admitted, eventually, that the necklace had never actually been stolen at all. She had hidden it herself, planting the story of its disappearance specifically to implicate Marissa, calculating that even an accusation later proven false would be enough to damage Marissa's reputation permanently, to frighten her away from an arrangement Vivian could no longer control through simple intimidation alone. Damien described the moment Vivian's composure finally broke entirely, how the careful, polished woman, who had spent years perfecting the correct image for every occasion, had suddenly looked, for the first time in his memory, genuinely frightened rather than calculating. She had not expected the documentation to exist. She had assumed, correctly in most cases, involving accusations against people without power or connections, that her word alone would carry enough weight to end the matter before anyone thought to question it seriously. She kept saying I owed her, Damien continued, his voice carrying a weariness Marissa had not heard from him before. Years of loyalty to the family, Years of playing the role expected of her, and she genuinely believed that entitled her to whatever she needed to do to protect her position. I don't think she ever once considered that what she was doing to you was wrong, only that it was necessary. Marissa listened, absorbing the full weight of what had nearly happened to her, understanding now just how differently this evening could have ended, had Grace not been present that day, had the photographs not existed, had she trusted the wrong instinct instead of the cautious one. She thought about how easily a life could be dismantled by someone with enough power and enough desperation, how quickly her years of careful work could have been erased by a lie convincing enough to be believed. "What did you say to her?" Marissa asked, when she admitted it. "I told her it was over," Damien said simply. "Not just the engagement. Any future involvement between our families and business matters as well. I meant what I said about loyalty being important, but loyalty requires honesty in return. She forfeited any claim to that the moment she decided fabricating a crime against an innocent person was an acceptable strategy. She said she did it because she could see where this was heading," Damien told Marissa, sitting across from her at the small table in the corner of the workshop, the same table where they had shared takeout weeks earlier during a conversation that now felt like it belonged to an entirely different lifetime. "Between us, she said she refused to lose everything she had built toward without a fight, even if that meant destroying someone who had nothing to do with the actual problems in our relationship." "What happens now?" Marissa asked quietly, though part of her already suspected the answer given the finality in his voice. "The engagement is over," Damien said. "It should have ended long before tonight. Honestly, I think we both knew that, long before you ever walked into my life with a torn dress and a letter I had no right to read." Marissa absorbed this information slowly, aware of the magnitude of what he was telling her, the collapse of an engagement that had been carefully constructed around family alliances and business interests, far beyond anything as simple as personal happiness. She understood, even without him saying it directly, that ending things with Vivian would carry consequences reaching well beyond hurt feelings, that the business relationships tied to that engagement would likely fracture as well, that Damien was choosing something significantly more complicated than a simple breakup. "Are you certain?" she asked. "This isn't just about tonight. This is about years of arrangements, family expectations. I don't want to be the reason you dismantle something that important without being completely certain it's what you actually want." Damien reached across the table, his hand covering hers with a gentleness that contrasted sharply against everything she knew about the dangerous world he moved through daily. "I've been certain for weeks," he said. "I was simply too tied to obligation to admit it, even to myself. Tonight just removed any excuse I had left for continuing to pretend otherwise." The following days brought exactly the complications Marissa had anticipated. Word spread quickly through the social circles connected to the Cross family, the broken engagement becoming a subject of speculation and gossip that inevitably found its way back to Marissa's workshop, whispered by clients who arrived for fittings and stayed to ask careful, probing questions about her relationship with Damien that she declined to answer directly. Vivian, for her part, did not disappear quietly. She gave interviews to select members of the press, carefully constructing a narrative that painted herself as the wronged party, seduced away from by a scheming designer who had used feminine manipulation to worm her way into a powerful family for personal gain. The story, though largely fabricated, gained enough traction to threaten real damage to Marissa's growing reputation. Several potential clients quietly withdrawing commissions rather than risk association with the controversy. "I never wanted this kind of attention," Marissa admitted to Damien one evening, scrolling through another article speculating about her supposed manipulation of a powerful, wealthy man. "I built my business on quality work, not scandal. This isn't the reputation I want attached to my name." "Give it time," Damien said, though even he could not entirely hide his frustration at the situation spiraling beyond either of their control. "The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, even in a city that prefers gossip to fact." But time, Marissa understood, was a luxury her business could not necessarily afford, not when commissions were being quietly canceled and her carefully built reputation hung suspended between vindication and permanent damage. The outcome, depending entirely on whether the truth could outrun the story Vivian had already set into motion. Grace brought her the third canceled commission of the week on a quiet Thursday afternoon. A client who had specifically requested Marissa's work only a month earlier, now sending a brief, apologetic email, citing scheduling conflicts that everyone in the room understood to be a polite fiction. Marissa read the email twice, then set her phone face down on the workbench, refusing to let the disappointment show on her face in front of her staff, though the weight of it settled heavily in her chest regardless. "This isn't fair," Noah said, frustration evident in his voice as he watched Marissa absorb yet another loss without complaint. "You didn't do anything wrong. She's the one who tried to frame you for theft, and somehow you're the one losing clients." "Fair has very little to do with how this industry works," Marissa said, though the bitterness in her own voice surprised her slightly. "Perception moves faster than truth. It always has. I learned that lesson a long time ago, just never quite this painfully." She thought about calling Damien, about asking him to intervene more directly, to use whatever influence his family name still carried to correct the narrative before more damage accumulated. But something in her resisted that instinct almost immediately. She had built her business through her own hands and her own reputation, and she refused to let its survival depend entirely on a man rescuing her from a problem his former fiancé had created. If her name was going to be cleared, she wanted it cleared through truth, eventually surfacing on its own merits, not through the quiet application of power behind closed doors. That evening, alone in her workshop long after her assistants had gone home, Marissa sat with a blank sheet of paper and began writing. Not another private letter to her mother this time, but something meant to be read publicly, a careful, honest account of everything that had happened since the night the original gown was destroyed. She wrote about her craft, about the years of work behind every stitch, about the accusation that had nearly ended her career, built entirely on fabricated evidence. She did not mention Vivian by name, choosing instead to let the facts speak plainly enough that anyone paying attention could draw their own conclusions. She did not know yet whether the letter would help or simply add fuel to a story already spinning beyond her control, but she understood, sitting alone with her own words in front of her, for the second time in this entire ordeal, that silence had never once protected her, and she was tired of letting other people write the story of who she was. The article ran on a Monday morning, and by noon, Marissa's phone would not stop ringing. She had submitted her written account to a respected local journalist 2 weeks earlier, a woman named Elena Voss, who covered the city's business and fashion scene with a reputation for careful, thorough reporting, rather than sensational speculation. Marissa had chosen her specifically because she trusted the journalist would verify every claim before publishing anything, and the resulting article reflected exactly that kind of diligence, laying out the full timeline of events with documentation to support every detail, from the original torn gown to the fabricated theft accusation and its swift collapse under scrutiny. The story spread quickly once it published, picked up by larger outlets within hours, the narrative shifting entirely away from the version Vivian had carefully constructed weeks earlier. Where Marissa had once been painted as a scheming opportunist, she was now recognized as a skilled designer who had weathered deliberate sabotage with remarkable composure, her craftsmanship finally receiving the kind of attention it had always deserved on its own merits, rather than through scandal. "Your inbox is going to explode," Grace said, staring at her own phone with wide eyes as she scrolled through a rapidly growing list of inquiries, flooding in from potential clients who had read the article and wanted to see Marissa's work for themselves. "I'm not exaggerating. This is actually happening." Marissa allowed herself a small, disbelieving laugh, still processing the sudden reversal of fortune after weeks of watching her reputation hang in uncertain balance. She thought about her mother, about the years of struggle that had led to this moment, about every person who had ever doubted that a plus-size designer working alone out of a modest workshop could build something worth this kind of attention. She scrolled through the article herself for the third time that morning, reading Elena Voss's careful prose with a strange sense of distance, as though the story belonged to someone else entirely, rather than the last few months of her own life. The journalist had been thorough in ways Marissa had not fully anticipated, tracking down former clients who spoke warmly about her professionalism, industry colleagues who confirmed her reputation for quality work long before any of this controversy began, even a former instructor from her design program who admitted, on the record, That the industry's narrow standards had cost it several talented designers over the years, Marissa included among the names he wished he had championed more loudly at the time. Noah appeared in the doorway of her office, holding a tablet, his expression somewhere between excitement and disbelief. "There's a wait list forming," he said. "An actual wait list. For commissions. I've never seen anything like this in the 2 years I've worked here." Marissa set her phone down and pressed both hands flat against her desk, steadying herself against a wave of emotion she had not expected to feel so suddenly. Gratitude and vindication, and something close to grief all tangled together at once, mourning the version of herself who had spent so many years believing she needed to shrink her ambitions to match what the industry was willing to offer someone who looked like her. The gala that evening had been planned for months, a charity event Damien's family had long supported, though this year's proceeds would benefit a foundation supporting emerging designers from backgrounds the industry traditionally overlooked. A cause Marissa had suggested herself during one of their earlier conversations, and Damien had quietly ensured was properly funded, without ever mentioning his involvement directly. Marissa arrived wearing a gown of her own design, deep sapphire silk that moved like water with every step, beading along the neckline, catching the light and patterns she had spent weeks perfecting. It was, she realized, as she studied her reflection before leaving her workshop, the first piece she had ever made specifically for herself, rather than for a client. A small but significant departure from years spent making other people beautiful, while rarely taking the time to do the same for her own reflection. The hall was already filled with guests when she arrived, conversation and soft music blending together beneath elegant chandeliers, and she felt the familiar flutter of nervousness that came with entering spaces she had once been told did not belong to people who looked like her. But that feeling settled quickly into something steadier, as she moved through the room, catching glimpses of her own past work on several guests, gowns she had designed for other clients, now mixing naturally among the crowd, as evidence of a reputation finally recognized on its own terms. A woman she did not recognize approached her near the entrance, introducing herself as the head of a foundation supporting young women entering design programs across the region, explaining that she had read the morning's article twice and wanted to discuss the possibility of Marissa speaking to a group of students later that year. Marissa agreed without hesitation, thinking of her own early years struggling to find anyone willing to take her seriously, understanding immediately how much it might have mattered to hear from someone who looked like her, succeeding openly rather than quietly, apologetically, at the margins of an industry that preferred to pretend people like her did not exist. Further into the room, she spotted the emerald gown itself, or rather a woman wearing a commission Marissa had completed only weeks earlier, the fabric catching the chandelier light exactly as she had intended when she first sketched the design. The woman noticed Marissa watching and crossed the room to thank her personally, gesturing toward the gown with obvious pride, and Marissa felt something settle warmly in her chest that no amount of professional praise had ever quite managed to reach before: the simple, uncomplicated joy of watching her work make someone else feel beautiful in a body the world too often told her to hide. Damien found her near the edge of the dance floor, his expression softening the moment he saw her, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, simply taking in the strange, winding path that had brought them to this particular evening together. "You look extraordinary," he said finally, his voice carrying a warmth that had nothing to do with the practiced charm he typically wore in rooms like this. "I made it myself," Marissa said, smoothing the fabric slightly, still slightly self-conscious under his attention, despite everything they had already been through together. "First time in years I've designed something just for me. It shows," he said. "There's a difference. I can't explain exactly what it is, but there's something different about work made from the heart rather than for a client's specifications." They danced together as the evening wore on, drawing quiet attention from guests who had clearly read the morning's article and were piecing together the full story unfolding in front of them. Marissa found she no longer cared about the whispered speculation the way she might have weeks earlier, understanding now that the truth of her own story, finally told honestly and completely, had rendered any remaining gossip powerless to damage her further. Vivian was not present that evening, having quietly withdrawn from social circles connected to the Cross family in the weeks since the engagement's collapse, her attempts to control the narrative having ultimately failed against the weight of documented truth. Marissa felt no particular satisfaction in her absence, only a quiet relief that the danger she had represented had finally passed, replaced by something considerably more hopeful than anything she had allowed herself to imagine when this entire story began with a torn seam and a ruined gown. She heard, secondhand, that Vivian had left the city entirely, relocating somewhere she was not known, and could presumably begin constructing a new version of herself, away from the wreckage of a scheme that had ultimately cost her far more than she had ever intended to lose. Marissa found she could not quite summon any lingering anger toward the news, only a distant, complicated sympathy for a woman who had apparently believed cruelty was the only currency capable of securing what she wanted, never once considering that honesty might have served her better in the long run. It was not a lesson Marissa could teach her, and she did not particularly wish to try. Some lessons, she understood, could only be learned through consequence. Damien's father approached them briefly during the evening, an older man with the same measured composure Marissa had come to recognize in his son, though his eyes carried decades more weariness. He studied Marissa for a long moment before speaking, and she braced herself for the kind of polite disapproval she had half expected from a man whose entire life had been built around strategic alliances rather than personal choice. "My son tells me you build things that cannot easily be torn apart," he said finally, his tone unreadable. "Dresses, reputations. I imagine that skill extends to other things as well." "I hope so," Marissa said carefully, uncertain exactly what he was testing her for. He nodded once, something that might have been approval flickering briefly across his features before he moved on to greet other guests, leaving Marissa slightly unsettled but strangely reassured, understanding that whatever complicated family politics still surrounded Damien's life, she had at least cleared some invisible threshold that mattered to the people who had known him longest. Later that night, after most of the guests had departed and the hall had grown quiet around them, Damien led Marissa toward a small balcony overlooking the city, the lights below spread out like scattered stars against the darkness. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small box, and Marissa felt her breath catch, though what he offered was not what she initially expected. Inside was a small pin, delicately crafted, shaped like a needle threaded with a single strand of deep emerald silk, the exact color of the gown she had made from nothing on the night they first met. "I had this made after that first evening," he said, watching her expression carefully. "I wasn't certain then what exactly it meant to me, or why I felt compelled to commission it. I understand now. I wanted something to remember the moment I first saw someone build something extraordinary out of what everyone else would have called disaster." Marissa took the pin carefully, turning it over in her hands, moved by the thoughtfulness behind such a small, specific gesture. "This is beautiful," she said quietly. "Thank you." She thought of every gift she had ever received from clients over the years, generous tips and kind words that always felt slightly transactional, despite genuine gratitude behind them, and understood immediately how different this felt in comparison. This was not payment for a service rendered. It was recognition, carefully considered and quietly commissioned, weeks before either of them had admitted aloud what was actually growing between them. Proof that Damien had been paying closer attention than she realized, even in that first chaotic evening, when neither of them could have predicted where the following months would lead. "I almost didn't give it to you," Damien admitted, a rare note of uncertainty creeping into his usually composed voice. "I told myself it was too soon, too forward, given everything else you were dealing with these past weeks. But watching you tonight, in a gown you made for no one but yourself, I realized I didn't want to keep waiting for some perfect, uncomplicated moment that might never actually arrive." "Nothing about this has been uncomplicated," Marissa said, a small, genuine laugh escaping her despite the emotion of the moment. "Torn dresses, and stolen jewelry accusations, and newspaper articles. I don't think we've had a single simple week since the day we met." "No," Damien agreed, smiling in the unguarded way she had come to treasure over these past months, so different from the careful, controlled expression he wore in every other room of his life. "But I've found I don't particularly want simple. I want honest. You've given me more of that in a few months than I've had in years, surrounded by people who measured every word before speaking it." "There's something else," Damien said, his voice steadier now, carrying the same quiet conviction she had come to recognize whenever he spoke about something that genuinely mattered to him. I know this has all happened faster than either of us probably expected, and I'm not asking for any promises tonight. But I wanted you to know that whatever comes next, business or otherwise, I intend to be part of your life for as long as you'll allow it. Not because of family obligation or strategic advantage, simply because you're the most honest, remarkable person I've encountered in a world that rarely rewards either of those qualities. Marissa looked out over the city lights, thinking about everything that had led to this particular moment: the torn dress, the hidden letter, the fabricated accusation, the article that had finally set the record straight. She thought about her mother, about the lessons learned at a kitchen table years ago, about remaking torn things into something new, something that told a different story than the one it started with. "I'd like that," she said finally, turning to face him fully. "Though I should warn you, I don't intend to slow down my work for anyone. Not even for this. I would never ask you to," Damien said, something like genuine amusement flickering across his expression. "I fell for the woman who rebuilt an entire gown from nothing in 10 minutes under impossible pressure. I have no interest in asking her to become someone smaller than that." In the weeks that followed, Marissa's business expanded beyond anything she had previously imagined possible. Commissions arriving from clients across the city, and eventually beyond it. Her name finally recognized not as a footnote in someone else's scandal, but as a designer whose skill spoke entirely for itself. She hired additional staff, expanded her workshop into a larger space that could accommodate the growing demand, and began mentoring young designers who reminded her painfully of her own early struggles, determined that no one under her guidance would ever be told their body disqualified them from creating beauty. She kept the emerald pin close always, a small reminder pinned discreetly to whatever she wore, a symbol of the night everything had changed, the night a torn seam revealed not weakness, but the beginning of something far stronger than anyone in that fitting room could have predicted. And though her relationship with Damien continued to draw occasional curiosity from a city that loved a good story, Marissa found she no longer needed anyone else's validation to know exactly who she was, or what she had built, entirely through her own two capable hands. She thought often, in the months that followed, about how differently her story might have ended had she reacted with panic instead of steady hands on that first chaotic evening, had she allowed humiliation to paralyze her instead of pushing her forward into 10 frantic minutes of creation. She had spent years believing that success in her industry required becoming smaller, quieter, less visible, folding herself into whatever narrow shape the fashion world found acceptable. Instead, she had built an entire future by refusing to shrink, by meeting disaster with skill instead of apology, and by insisting, again and again, that her work and her body both deserved to be seen exactly as they were. Her first group of mentees arrived that autumn, 6 young designers from backgrounds the industry had traditionally overlooked, each of them carrying the same quiet uncertainty Marissa recognized instantly from her own early years. She taught them everything her mother had once taught her at that small kitchen table: how fabric held memory, how a torn seam could always become something new if approached with patience rather than panic. And she watched with quiet pride as each of them slowly began to trust their own instincts the way she had once struggled to trust hers. The gown that started it all, the one Vivian had torn apart in a moment of jealous cruelty, hung eventually in Marissa's expanded workshop, framed behind glass, alongside the emerald dress that had replaced it, a permanent reminder to every young designer who walked through her doors that even the most devastating tear could become, with enough skill and enough courage, the beginning of something entirely new.